For most of human history, the soul was not a question. It was an answer. Every civilization that has ever existed, separated by oceans and centuries and entirely different belief systems, arrived independently at the same conclusion: that there is something inside you that is not your body, something that thinks and feels and persists. The Greeks called it psyche. The Egyptians called it Ka. The Hindus called it Atman. The Abrahamic traditions called it the soul. Different words, the same idea. You are more than your body, and what you are does not end when your body does. Then science arrived, and for 300 years, science systematically dismantled this idea. Darwin explained the origin of species without a creator. Neuroscience mapped the brain region by region and found that every human experience, memory, emotion, personality, even love, could be located in specific neural structures. Damage the hippocampus, and you lose the ability to form new memories, alter serotonin levels, and personality shifts. The soul, it seemed, was simply what people called the brain before they understood what the brain was. By the late 20th century, the soul was not a serious scientific question. It was a category error. Consciousness was what the brain did. When the brain stopped, consciousness stopped. Case closed. And then something happened that nobody expected. The scientists most committed to explaining consciousness in purely physical terms ran into a problem they could not solve. Not a problem they had not solved yet. A problem that the more carefully they looked at it, the less solvable it appeared. One of the philosophers who named it called it the hard problem of consciousness. And the harder they looked, the harder it got. Here is the problem. You are having an experience right now. You are hearing these words, processing their meaning. Somewhere in that process, there is something it is like to be you, right now, in this moment. Philosophers call this qualia, the redness of red, the pain of pain, the feeling of curiosity when you encounter an idea you have not considered before. Neuroscience can tell you exactly what happens in your brain when you see the color red. It can map the photons hitting your retina, trace the signal through your optic nerve, show you precisely which neurons fire in your visual cortex. What it cannot do is explain why any of that physical process produces an experience. Why there is something it is like to see red, rather than simply a mechanical process happening in the dark, unfelt, like the cooling of a rock. This gap is not small. It is not the kind of gap more data will close. It is a conceptual gap between two entirely different kinds of things: physical processes on one side, subjective experience on the other, and no bridge between them. Philosopher David Chalmers named this the hard problem in 1995. He was clear about why it is hard. Not because we lack information about the brain, but because no amount of information about physical processes seems to even point toward an explanation of why those processes produce experience at all. You can describe the entire neural architecture of a human brain in perfect detail and still have said nothing about why that architecture produces something it is like to be a person. Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA, spent the last decades of his life trying to solve consciousness. He died before finding it. His collaborator Christof Koch continued the work and recently said publicly that after 40 years of searching, he now believes the problem may be fundamentally unsolvable within the current scientific framework. This is not a fringe view. This is one of the most respected neuroscientists in the world, saying the project he gave his career to may be impossible in principle. Roger Penrose, one of the greatest mathematical physicists alive, has argued that consciousness cannot be explained by classical physical processes at all. He and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed that consciousness involves quantum processes inside neurons. Controversial, contested. But the fact that a mind like Penrose's is going there tells you something important about how seriously the best scientists are taking this problem. And then there is the conclusion that several serious philosophers have reached by following the logic wherever it leads, not because they wanted to go there, because they could find nowhere else to go. Panpsychism. The idea that consciousness is not something that emerges from matter at a certain level of complexity, that it is a fundamental feature of reality itself. That experience goes all the way down, that the universe is not made of unconscious matter that occasionally produces consciousness. That consciousness is as fundamental as space, time, and mass. Philosopher Philip Goff at Durham University has argued for panpsychism not as a spiritual claim, but as the most coherent scientific hypothesis available for explaining why consciousness exists at all. David Chalmers himself has called it the most serious contender for solving the hard problem. These are not mystics, they are some of the most careful analytical thinkers in the world following an argument to its logical conclusion. And that conclusion structurally mirrors what the soul was always claiming. That mind is not simply what matter does. That consciousness is irreducible to physical processes. That the universe is, at some level, minded. Science did not prove the soul exists. What science found, when it looked carefully enough, is that the assumption underlying the dismissal of the soul, that matter is fundamentally unconscious, and consciousness simply emerges from sufficient complexity, is an assumption that cannot currently be justified. The scientists who went looking to explain consciousness away found instead a question that gets harder the more carefully you look at it. They did not find the soul. They found something that might be worse. A universe in which the existence of inner experience cannot be explained by anything we currently understand about how the physical world works. You are having an experience right now. You have always known that. What you may not have known is that science, for all its extraordinary power, still cannot tell you why. And the more honestly it confronts that fact, the less certain it becomes that it ever will. The soul was supposed to be the answer that science replaced. Instead, science found a question that the soul was always trying to answer. And it turns out that question is harder than anyone on either side was prepared to admit.